This presentation will describe the process we follow in preparing and filing tax returns. We're going to take a look at activities that might occur and in some cases must occur when executing the overall process. So let's start by taking a look at the steps involved. Here are the major steps in the overall process we follow. First, a client facilitator or someone performing that role will screen and interview the taxpayer. Now, the taxpayer documentation will then be provided to a tax counselor who interviews the taxpayer or taxpayers if a joint return and prepares the taxpayer's federal and state tax returns. So the taxpayer will then meet with a quality reviewer who will walk through the returns, providing an explanation of the results and answering any remaining questions that the taxpayer may have. So the taxpayer is then provided with a physical copy of their returns and, after providing approval to file, has their returns electronically filed, although in some cases it may be necessary to file a paper return. I want to emphasize that the taxpayer is ultimately responsible for their tax return, but we, all of us, need to do our best to completely capture taxpayer information in order to file an accurate and complete return. In addition, our tax counselors and quality reviewers must do their best to ensure that taxpayers understand the contents and the results of their returns. So as part of this process, we'll interact directly with individual taxpayers. Remember, we aren't adversaries. Right? The taxpayers are here for our support, and we're here to provide support as best we can. In general, engage the taxpayers, speak clearly, allowing the taxpayer to fully respond to any questions, and ask questions to help clarify the taxpayer's situation. Now, if you aren't sure of something, don't be afraid to say, let me check on that for you. Now, you hear questions like, can I claim my brother Jimmy as a dependent? Or, is the unemployment I received last year taxable? Now, one of my favorite questions is always, I didn't need to file taxes for the last 5 years, and nothing changed this year, so I don't need to file this year either, right? Now, they may not need to file, but they might want to, especially if they're eligible for credits that they might receive. So we had a couple who said they didn't need to file, and they were right, but they were entitled to a tax credit of $1,200 and had been entitled to the same credit for years. Now, we were able to file 3 years of tax returns, and they received almost $3,500. So remember, the only tax counselors who've been certified for a specific year, should be answering tax-related questions and preparing tax returns for that year. If this will be your first year as a tax counselor, that means you should only be working with tax returns for tax year 2024. And by the way, the local coordinator in charge of a site might not be certified as tax counselor, in which case they shouldn't be answering tax questions as well. Here's a flow chart of the overall Tax-Aide process. It kind of depicts a day in the life of one of our taxpayers and how they interact with us. So let's assume a taxpayer is visiting a site where they have an appointment, or they're a walk-in, let's say, who will be physically at the site while their returns are being generated. So to begin, the taxpayer arrives and is greeted by someone acting in the role of client facilitator. Now, at some of our sites, we may also have greeters who would greet the taxpayers and assign them to a client facilitator when one's available. The client facilitator helps make the taxpayers feel welcome and at ease, hopefully, gathering and organizing their paperwork, describing the tax preparation process, and conducting an intake interview. They also act as our first layer for screening situations that are or may be out of scope. So we'll talk a lot more about the intake booklet in just a minute, but one of the initial actions taken by a client facilitator is to ensure the taxpayer has completed an intake booklet before moving on to the tax counselor. Now, if at any time while the client facilitator is working with the taxpayer that they feel something's not right, they should alert the local coordinator who's responsible for taking any necessary actions. Assuming a taxpayer documentation's been collected and organized, an available tax counselor is then assigned to work with the taxpayer to prepare their return, which is shown at the bottom of the process chart in green. So the tax counselor reviews the intake booklet and interviews the taxpayer prior to starting the return, to ensure all the necessary documentation is available and to make sure there are no scope issues prior to starting the return. Now, if there is a scope issue, we want to resolve the issue as soon as possible, potentially saving both the taxpayer and our volunteers valuable time. Upon completion of the tax return, the completed return and taxpayer-provided documentation is turned over to a quality reviewer, who reviews the intake booklet and checks the tax return for accuracy and completeness. Assuming there are no issues, the quality reviewer meets with the taxpayer to explain the results of the return, answering any questions the taxpayer may have. So upon taxpayer approval, the taxpayer is then asked to authorize Tax-Aide to electronically file the return by physically signing an authorization form. Now, if authorized to file, we do so as soon as possible. Now, hopefully at the end of this process, the taxpayer leaves the site with a copy of their completed tax return, and they're pleased with how well the process was performed. And one last time, it needs to be mentioned that if at any time during the process it becomes known that a return might be out of scope or there might be an issue with the taxpayer, the local coordinator should be notified immediately. Okay, there are sites where there are no dedicated client facilitators. Now, if you're volunteering at one of those sites, or you're at a site where for whatever reason a client facilitator is not available, you need to be prepared to perform in the role of client facilitator and a tax counselor. So we're going to walk through the intake steps that you may need to perform. The first step is to verify the identity of the taxpayer. Two forms of identification are required: photo ID and a social security number. Now, ask the taxpayer or taxpayers for photo ID. Shown here are acceptable examples of photo IDs: a state driver's license, a state ID card, or a passport. Verify photo and name. You must verify the identity of both taxpayers for joint returns. Now, we cannot process a tax return for an adult who's not present and therefore can't be properly identified. So examples of this are like an adult who brings in paperwork for a parent or an adult child. Now, any issues with proper identification should be brought to the attention of the local coordinator for resolution. Now, we had a situation where a taxpayer lost his wallet and had not yet received a replacement license. However, he had been a neighbor of one of our tax counselors for many years, and we had filed his taxes for several years. In this case, as we knew who he was, we prepared his return. If only one taxpayer in a joint return is available when the return is generated, we can still generate the return. However, we'll not file the return until we've received positive identification for both taxpayers, and they both have to sign the form authorizing us to electronically file the return. So Social Security numbers can be provided via a Social Security card, a Social Security benefit statement, or a prior year's return. Now, if a taxpayer can provide a Social Security card images on a smartphone, that's acceptable, providing the local coordinator agrees. If a taxpayer doesn't have a Social Security card, ask them if they have a Social Security benefit statement. Although the last 6 digits in box 2 of the form shown here are crossed out, the full Social Security number is displayed on a real Social Security benefit statement issued by the government. Now, if the taxpayer doesn't have a Social Security card or Social Security benefit statement, they may use a prior year's tax return to verify their Social Security number if we generated the return. Now, if we didn't generate the return, check with your local coordinator. The intake, interview, and quality review sheet, which is commonly referred to as the intake booklet, is an IRS document that Tax-Aide adapts for its use. So an effective interview is key to completing an accurate return. The taxpayer completes the booklet before they sit down with the counselor who's preparing their return. It's a structured way for the taxpayer to provide information about their personal tax situation. So it must be completed each year and for the correct tax year. The client facilitator would normally review the intake booklet to make sure it's complete and the taxpayer has all the necessary documents. A tax counselor uses the booklet to conduct their intake interview, make any changes, and ensure they have all the necessary information to complete the return. Finally, the quality reviewer uses the booklet to verify that the counselor has entered all the taxpayer information correctly. Let's look at each page of the intake booklet. As we discussed, the taxpayer must provide a picture ID for themselves and their spouse if it's a joint return. Now, a very important question is whether the taxpayer lived or worked in more than one state. A yes here is a tip-off to the counselor that a part-year state return, more than one state return, or a non-resident state return may be necessary. Now, we're not going to discuss state returns until December, but be aware that counselors must be certified to work on taxes involving other states. At some sites, part-year, multi-state, and non-resident returns might be out of scope. Let the local coordinator know immediately if the yes box is checked or one of the tax documents the taxpayer provides is from a state other than Massachusetts. Again, on the first page of the intake booklet is a section for personal information, including address and phone number. This year, an optional field has been added for pronouns. Verify citizenship status. Check if the taxpayer has been issued an identity PIN. If they indicate they've been issued an identity PIN, ensure it was issued for the calendar year in which they're filing, not the tax year. As an example, if a taxpayer be filing returns for 2023 and 2024 during calendar year 2025, they need a PIN issued in 2025. Now, the PIN will need to be entered into TaxLayer for a return to file electronically. There's also a question concerning digital assets, which is important because some digital asset transactions are out of scope. What's the taxpayer marital status? Single, married, legally separated, divorce? It's particularly important to know the date of the divorce if the taxpayer is divorced. At a minimum, we just need to know the year of the divorce, not the exact date. Now, the reason for needing this date is to determine how alimony is treated if alimony is being paid by one former spouse to the other. The banking information section is where the taxpayer chooses how they'd like to receive a refund or pay a balance due. We need to know how a taxpayer will pay for any amount due, or how the taxpayer would like to receive their money if due a refund. So taxpayers who wish to perform a direct deposit of a refund or have funds directly debited from a bank account must provide their account information. Now, this is normally done by providing us with a voided check. Sometimes they'll provide a deposit slip. Please remember that deposit slips don't always have the correct account numbers. So if a taxpayer doesn't provide a voided check, their account information might be found on a prior year's federal and state return. Check with your local coordinator if the taxpayer wants to use a bank account but can't positively provide the information during the intake process. Now, there's also questions concerning taxpayer language preferences. If the taxpayer would like assistance in registering to vote, and an option to contribute $3 to the presidential election campaign. Now, if a taxpayer doesn't answer these questions, mark their answer as no. Dependent information. Now, the counselor needs to complete the question about whether the taxpayer or spouse can be claimed on anyone else's return, because it often requires a discussion to arrive at the correct answer. The taxpayer enters information at the bottom of this page about anyone other than their spouse who may be claimed on the return. That is, people who live with them or who they supported. Now, the counselor completes all the gray areas shaded on the form. On this page, that area is used to answer questions that help the counselor determine whether the individuals listed are considered dependents or not. I want to pause for just a moment to discuss tax return notes with our tax counselors in training. Tax counselors will be learning about the use of notes in the tax software we use. But at this point, I want to let you know that this would be a good time to write a comment on the intake form that will let anyone who might need to look at or perform a review of the return why someone listed in this section is not a dependent. Now, the use of notes in the software application can eliminate a lot of confusion, not just for the current tax year, but in some instances for returns to be filed for a year or more in the future. We'll soon learn of an excellent resource tool that will be very helpful in determining whether someone qualifies as a dependent. Page 2 of the intake booklet is where the taxpayer and spouse enter their income information. They should only check the boxes that apply to themselves. At the beginning of each item, you'll see a B for basic, an A for advanced, or an M for military. These indicate the certification level that's required to work with that type of income. Now, all Tax-Aide counselors certify at the advanced level, which includes the basic level. But we require additional military certification to do M returns. So if you're interviewing a taxpayer and you see an item checked for which you aren't certified, you'll need to discuss it with your local coordinator. If there aren't two counselors at your site who are certified for an item, it's out of scope for your site. I'll give you a hint that a question on one of the exams we'll be taking will ask what level of certification is required for a specific type of income. It's on the exam every year. Just look at the Form 13614C, the intake booklet, for that type of income, and you'll have your answer. Now note, questions about renting out personal residence for fewer than 15 days, income from the sale of personal property, such as a vehicle, and gambling winnings. Now the counsel uses the gray area on the right side of the form when conducting the interview. It's organized in a way that helps the counselor verify that the taxpayer isn't missing any information. Now this side of the booklet contains helpful notes about which forms are associated with each type of income. Note the space for the counselor to indicate whether the taxpayer itemized last year when discussing any state tax refund they received. Now this will help determine whether the refund should be included as income on this year's return. On the far right is an area in which the counselor can make notes. Page 3 covers expenses incurred by the taxpayer and certain life events that might have tax consequences for them. Now notice the sale of a home. Only the sale of personal residences, including vacation homes that are not rented out, are in scope. In the gray shaded area, counselors can note whether the taxpayer is itemizing or using the standard deduction this year. And just on page 2, on the right side of this page, are notes that the counselor can follow when conducting the interview and space for the counselor to add notes that the quality reviewer might need. Page 4 has demographic questions that the IRS requests the taxpayer complete. The taxpayer answers the 4 questions at the top. Both the taxpayer and spouse answer those at the bottom. Now the taxpayer on the left and the spouse on the right. These are all optional. If the taxpayer doesn't answer them, we don't spend time trying to get the answers. Just enter them into the tax software, that's TaxLayer, as did not answer. Or the taxpayer can opt for prefer not to answer, which is also a choice. Now, the Mandatory Privacy Act notice is on this page. The data from these questions are used mainly for statistical purposes to apply for grants to fund our free tax assistance service. So if someone asks why we need this information, you'd be telling the truth to say, well, having this information helps to fund our ability to provide tax services for free. Page 5 of the booklet has space for any notes that the counselor or quality reviewer may want to make. Again, Document anything you may not be sure of, or any information the quality reviewer may need. So if a taxpayer, especially one that we supported in the past, is lacking any documentation, I prefer to move forward with generating their return instead of turning them away and asking them to return. They can always contact a bank, a brokerage firm, or other appropriate institution on the phone while the return is being generated to obtain the necessary information. They can always receive a refund or pay a balance due via check using the U.S. Postal Service. Yeah, it takes longer to receive a refund this way, but the returns can be filed that way. And before I forget, we prepare tax returns with the expectation that we, Tax-Aide, will file a return. I've worked with taxpayers who set up an appointment, had us generate their returns, and then said, "Oh, I already prepared my returns. I just want to check my return against what you came up with." If you hear a taxpayer mention anything about having us check their return, let your local coordinator know immediately. We do have people visit our sites just to ask questions. If someone asks a tax-related question and is not asking to have the taxes prepared by us, let the local coordinator know. Now, we're always willing to answer questions. That is, if it doesn't impact our taxpayers who have appointments. Okay, knowledge check. Question 1. Marge arrives at the site without having completed her intake booklet. When the client facilitator asks her to fill it in, Marge responds that she has last year's sheet, so she doesn't need to fill in one this year. Is this acceptable? Well, the answer is no. A new booklet is required for every tax return, so each year a different booklet and a booklet for that year must be completed. All right, knowledge check 2. The counselor and quality reviewer can choose whether or not to use the intake sheet when conducting the interview with the taxpayer. Is that true or false? Well, the answer is false. It's a requirement that the intake booklet is used throughout the process of preparing and quality reviewing a return. Now, in addition to these 5 pages of the IRS booklet, WARP Tax-Aide adds 3 consents that the taxpayer can choose to either accept or reject. It's up to them. So the first page of the consents explains the 3 consents. First consent is global carry forward. The second consent is the consent to disclose information to WARP Foundation. And the third consent is the consent for WARP to use tax return information. We'll explain each of these in just a moment. So there are 3 consent forms. We'll need to ensure that we're able to explain the purpose of these forms to the taxpayers if they ask. Now, the taxpayers can accept them or decline them. That's their choice. They must sign each of the forms that they accept. If it's a joint return, both taxpayers must agree and sign, or the answer is no. Let's take a look at each of the consent forms. Okay, global carry forward consent. So if a taxpayer has their taxes prepared at a Tax-Aide or a VITA site and goes to a different Tax-Aide or VITA site the next year or beyond, now the counselors at that site may be able to import basic personal information such as name, address, date of birth into the new return, and in addition, information from tax documents filed in past years like employer information found on W-2s. Now, this can help counselors from having to re-enter information, which definitely helps to save time in the tax return preparation process. Now, if they don't agree to this consent, the taxpayers, then their information would only be available at the site where a prior year's return was prepared. Now, just a procedural issue. When a tax return is complete, the demographic information on the intake form and information on the consent forms is recorded by the tax counselor into the software. Now, it doesn't impact the tax return. It just captures information for use by the IRS and Tax-Aide. If the consent form is blank, then the tax counselor inputting the data can't be sure whether the taxpayers declined the consent or if the initial interviewer, who most often is a client facilitator, just forgot to ask on the consent with the taxpayer. I always take a pen and run a big X, like shown here, across each consent page the taxpayers declined, so there's no misunderstanding as to whether they saw the form or not. So here's consent 2, the consent to disclose tax return information to VITA TCE tax preparation sites, including Tax-Aide. This consent allows taxpayer information to be shared with the Tax-Aide Foundation and is combined with other taxpayer information for the purpose of obtaining grant funding. It's one very important way we're able to provide this service for free. If a taxpayer asks which of these consents they should sign, like which is the one that means the most to them, this is the one, right? As it helps to keep the service we provide to the taxpayers free of charge. Consent 3 is the consent for WRP Foundation, that's the charitable part of WRP, to use select tax return information. That's to send information to taxpayers who may be able to benefit from other free WRP Foundation programs and services. These include programs and services dealing with income, housing, hunger, volunteering, like us, employment, especially for elders, and more. Taxpayers should sign this form if they want to allow the WRP Foundation, again, the charitable arm of WRP, to send them information about these free programs and services. Now, this data is not shared with the parent WRP organization or WRP services, where they market things like insurance and so forth. And this doesn't result in taxpayers receiving any membership, or marketing offers. All right, to conclude this section, the taxpayer signature indicates an agreement with the consent form. Taxpayers can sign one, two, all, or none of the consent forms. No signature indicates no consent. If a joint return, both spouses must sign to approve. All right, now let's discuss arranging the documents. So the goal is to try and arrange all similar documents together. Okay, when documents are arranged, it's recommended to place the intake booklet on top, and then documents according to where they appear in the intake form. So income documents from page 2 of the booklet, then expenses, credits, and life events from page 3 of the intake booklet. Now, I always place the Social Security benefit form, if it's available, at the front of the income documents, as it contains the taxpayer's Social Security number. As the Social Security number is what a counselor needs to start the preparation of a return, having this available right up front saves the counselor time. Massachusetts-specific documents will be covered in the Massachusetts tax law training. Now, when organizing documents, make sure they're for the current tax year. Now, taxpayers will sometimes include prior year tax documents. This document would have been included in a tax return for tax year 2022. In our upcoming tax season, documents should state they are for tax year 2024. Now, watch out, because we have taxpayers who provide paperwork for prior years and ask us to prepare tax returns for those years. And remember, if they do, they need to fill out an intake booklet for those prior years, specific to the year they're filing for. Taxpayers will often provide documents that are not required. Examples of this are yearly Social Security statements. One of them is pictured on this slide. Monthly bank and mortgage statements, credit card payments, and monthly or quarterly statements from brokerage companies. Just place all of these documents behind the actual tax documents. Ask the taxpayer if they have their prior year return. Now, having the prior year return will help the tax counselors and reviewers, quality reviewers, ensure there are no missing documents. Now, as mentioned earlier, if a taxpayer had a W-2 for wages earned the year before but no W-2 in the current year, or let's say 3 retirement incomes formed from one year and only one the next, we might suspect that something's missing. So always question the taxpayer. So that's a lot we do. How can we improve that process? Well, one way is through the use of job aids. Those are tools and guides that provide simple instruction on how to complete a task. So they're used to either introduce new steps in a process or to help people remember how to complete tasks more efficiently. Right? Well, at this point, all the steps are new to us. While understanding and remembering how to complete the intake and interview tasks that'll happen over time. It'd be nice to have job aids to guide us along the way. And the good news is we have them. In fact, no matter what role or roles we play and what functions we perform as tax-aide volunteers, there are job aids available that can help us. So each site may use different or slightly different job aids, but I'm going to present job aids that have proved to be very useful in ensuring that our front-end taxpayer data collection is complete. First, we'll discuss the client facilitator checklist. In addition, we'll look at 2 job aids, the self-employed worksheet and the itemized deductions worksheet that can move the burden of organizing some of the documents from your shoulders to those of the taxpayer and potentially save a lot of time. And finally, we'll look at a form that provides information that's of value in generating taxpayers' Massachusetts tax returns. Remember, we're providing assistance to the taxpayers in generating and filing their returns. There's nothing we can do if the taxpayer fails, that's whether consciously or unconsciously, to provide us with information that can affect their final return. Okay, here's a copy of the client facilitator checklist that we used at our site last year. Note, the very first question is a scope issue dealing with cryptocurrency that, if answered yes, would have potentially ruled the taxpayer's return out of scope for Tax-Aide. Now, volunteers may be unsure concerning the correct answer to some of these items. It takes some experience to get the feel for, what are, quote, significant medical expenses, right? But if someone mentions they had major surgeries and medical bills during the tax year, they should probably be asked to provide receipts and amounts. Now, we'll discuss why later. Check with your local coordinator to see if a variation of this checklist is used at your site. Now, taxpayers who are self-employed are allowed to offset earnings with expenses to reduce their taxable income. But they're expected to have documentation for all expenses, and that may include receipts and or logs. Now, I've experienced self-employed people who brought in a disorganized shoebox full of receipts and expected our volunteers to generate a return. Now, to prevent this from happening, this self-employed Schedule C worksheet can be used. All self-employed taxpayers are asked to arrange their expenses by category and write the total amounts in the appropriate boxes. This saves a lot of time and frustration for our volunteers. Now note that at the very top of this worksheet are questions that deal with scope. Answering yes to any of these questions would make a return out of scope for Tax-Aide. So if any of these were checked, the taxpayer should be referred to the local coordinator. Now remember, we always want to identify out-of-scope issues as early in the process as possible. We want to avoid any unnecessary effort on our part and any waste of time on the taxpayer's part. During the intake process, you may also encounter self-employed taxpayers who provide totals with little or no receipts to support their claims. Now, I worked with an individual my first year who had totals for his expenses, but no documentation. When asked if he could provide the documentation if requested by the government, he said he could. We generated his return after documenting with notes in the tax software that the taxpayer was fully informed and understood he needed to be able to produce the documentation if requested by the government. Now, having said that, it's probably a good point to discuss shady taxpayers. We do see them, and you will. Or at least shady practices that some taxpayers may try to use. Now, I was working with a taxpayer who had self-employment income and a bunch of expenses. And we'll be learning all about offsetting business income with business expenses in the upcoming discussion. But for now, let's just simply say if someone has more business expenses than business income, they have a net business loss. So for Tax-Aide, even if the net business loss is $1, then a return is out of scope and the taxpayer should be directed by whoever is the site lead to seek out a professional paid tax preparer. By the way, we should always use the generic terms paid tax preparer or professional paid tax preparer, not the actual name of any for-profit tax preparation company. So I was working with a taxpayer, and the taxpayer had more business expenses than income by about $300. As the site lead, I told the taxpayer that the return was out of scope for us. So the reply was, so what if we just leave out $300 of my expenses? You could prepare the return then, right? Well, my answer was, no, I can't. I know your business expenses are more than your business income because you just told me, right? Now that I know that, I'd be committing fraud if I prepared your return. So if it's clear to you that the taxpayer is not being honest, or you suspect, right, that they're not being honest, bring this to the attention of the local coordinator immediately and let them deal with the situation. Okay, prior to tax law changes in 2017, about 30% of all taxpayers chose to file taxes using itemized deductions instead of standard deduction. Following those tax law changes, the number of taxpayers who itemize has dropped to less than 10%. And that percentage may be even less at your site. I know it is at ours. Now, although the number of taxpayers who itemize might have changed, the amount of paperwork some of them provide hasn't, right? I work with taxpayers who bring in a box full of medical bills and charitable contribution receipts, and they expect us to organize and add the totals, for them. Similar to self-employment worksheet in the prior slide, the itemized deduction worksheet is an excellent job aid that can be used to minimize time spent trying to organize and total itemized deductions. So again, this places the burden of providing totals by category on taxpayers, not our volunteers. Note that out-of-scope questions are located at the top of the worksheet. Once again, if you believe a taxpayer's return would be out of scope based on these questions, immediately alert the local coordinator, who will then make the final decision. Now, I want to add that the vast majority of taxpayers are capable of organizing and totaling up categories of information such as itemized deductions. There are a few, however, a few, who are really not capable of doing so. Now, over time, it becomes easier to identify those taxpayers who really need extra support. All I'm going to say is a little patience goes a long way. I always tell some of our volunteers, those are the people that we're most there for. Just going to let you know that there's also a Massachusetts intake form. We're going to discuss this form when we do the Massachusetts training. Okay, scope, right? I'd like to reinforce the need to be aware of scope. What's inside scope for Tax-Aide and what's outside scope for Tax-Aide. We have two documents that can be referenced to help determine whether a return is in scope or out. The first is a one-page form that lists what is in scope on the left and what's out of scope on the right. Very summary form. This form should be posted in an area where the intake interview process is performed. Now at our site, we have this form posted on a big poster board. The scope in on the right should be referenced by tax counselors when they need to make a determination on scope. Again, all determinations should be brought to the attention of the local coordinator. Okay, knowledge checks. Let's check what we've learned. Okay, knowledge check 1. A taxpayer does not have Social Security cards for two dependents but did bring a copy of last year's return that was completed by a professional preparer. What do you do? Well, what we should do is discuss the situation with the local coordinator to determine if you can use a copy of last year's return to confirm Social Security numbers. We would certainly do it at our site if we had prepared it the year before, but with a professional preparer, or if the taxpayer did it themselves, then that's a decision for the local coordinator to make. Knowledge check 2. Upon questioning, a taxpayer responds that she received $6 in interest as shown in a bank statement. Now, the taxpayer didn't receive a tax form for the $6 in interest. What do you do? Okay, all income should be reported. Note the $6 of interest received on the intake form. And knowledge check 3. There are the 3 consent forms: global carry forward consent, consent to disclose the use information to AARP Foundation, and the AARP Foundation programs or services. Match them up to the letters on the right. There they are, the global carry forward consent. That's basic data used next year if the taxpayer goes to a different Tax-Aide Avita site. Consent to disclose or use information to AARP Foundation. That's data used for statistical purposes to obtain grants to support program. And finally, the AARP Foundation programs and services. Remember, that's the charitable arm of AARP. That's data for free AARP Foundation programs that would be provided to the taxpayer if they request. Is it okay if the taxpayer doesn't sign any of the consent forms? And the answer is yes. They can choose to sign 1, 2, 3, or none of the consent forms. That's their decision. And the last knowledge check. So a taxpayer says he's self-employed, but the only documentation provided is some poorly handwritten notes, and his answers during the interview are inconsistent and evasive. So what do you do? Well, you need to discuss the situation with your local coordinator, as always. You shouldn't prepare a return if you're uncomfortable with the results of your interview. And to add to this, now we can rely in good faith on information from the taxpayer without requiring documentation as verification if it's a returning taxpayer and they've established credibility with us. But it's up to the local coordinator to resolve it one way or the other. Remember, you can't pretend you didn't hear something. If a taxpayer says she or he earned $400 in cash and then says, "Oh, let's just forget about that and not enter it," make sure to let the local coordinator know. It's same as if something about the taxpayer seems to be off. All right, as this is a recorded presentation, there's no chance to ask for any questions or comments, but this is the end of this presentation.